Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present this work, Production Networks and Firm-Level Elasticities of Substitution. This is joint work with Brian Savalas-Fuji, who is also in the audience, and Gaurav Khanna. The motivation really for this project is the fact that being able to substitute across supplies after shocks is key for the resilience of global supply chains. For example, a shock to a small subset of rubber producers will easily transmit downstream to car manufacturer if the interim tire manufacturer has a hard time substituting across the different rubber suppliers. This is precisely the question that we're going to ask in this paper today. How complementary or substitutes are the supplies of the same product? After we estimate this elasticity, we're going to quantify their importance in the propagation of shocks through firm networks, and we will show that in the presence of these complementarities, even small shocks can propagate to the entire supply chain as the worst affected sectors become bottlenecks in the production process. While there exist estimates of this elasticity of substitution across supplies located in different industries, there is hardly any estimate of this elasticity for supplies located within the same industry. And it is precisely this gap in the literature that we seek to fill. The reason for this gap lies in the difficulty of finding detailed firm-to-firm input transaction data, as well as finding an exogenous source of variation in prices that can induce the necessary variation to estimate these elasticities. We utilize a novel administrative data from a large Indian state that tracks daily firm-to-firm transaction. We provide estimates of these elasticities by using an identification strategy that leverages India's sudden lockdown policy due to COVID that was implemented at the end of March 2020. This lockdown, the economic restrictions induced by this lockdown policy made it costly for firms to produce and transport these inputs, thereby inducing variation in input costs that help us estimate these elasticities. We find evidence of very high levels of complementarity across supplies, even within the same industry, and about 0.52. We then embed these elasticities in an extended production model as in Devaki and Farhai, and we show that in the presence of such complementarities, shock to even a small subset of firms can affect the entire production network. The map shows the distribution of lockdown zones are determined on the basis of number of COVID cases. The red zones are the zones with the most severe restrictions on economic activities, and the green zones are the zones with the least severe restrictions on economic activities. It is these variations in economic restrictions induced by these lockdowns that we're going to use to estimate our elasticities of substitution. The estimating equation that we derive from the model that we take to the data basically relates the expenditure share by buyer B from industry J on inputs from seller S in industry I in month T relative to the total expenditure by buyer B on inputs from industry I in month T to the corresponding relative price. So epsilon is a measure of the degree of substitutability across supplies located within the same industry. So basically, it's a measure of how easy or difficult it is for you to substitute across your many different supplies within the same industry. Here we are in the industry is the HS2 that we're talking about. We control for buyer destination shocks, origin fixed effects, COVID cases, and a bunch of exposure to international demand and supply shocks. However, even with this very rich set of controls and fixed effects, it is possible that OLS estimation generates bias in our estimates, and that is because of the existence of possible simultaneous demand and supply shocks due to COVID. It is because what we're trying to do here is essentially trace the slope of the firm's input demand curve. Now, to trace the slope of the firm's input demand curve, we need external supply shifters to the firm's input supply curve. Now, to get there, what we do, notice that the price charged by seller S to buyer B consists of two components. The first is the seller's marginal cost, which depends on the which is at the level of the seller, product, and month, and the transportation cost, which depends on the distance between the buyer and the seller and how difficult it is to transport these goods in month T. Now, these two sources of variation inspire two different instruments. The first is our seller level instrument that essentially uses variations in the seller's marginal cost that is induced by the lockdown. Here we interact the seller's lockdown zone with the timing of the lockdown to generate variations in prices that are driven solely by the lockdown policy. Now, our second instrument is at the seller-buyer level instrument. This is here we use variations in transportation costs that are driven by the policy. To do that, we look at the shortest distance from the seller to the buyer through which the goods must pass, and we count the share of red and orange zones in this route using the Dijkstra algorithm. So this instrument basically isolates variations in the prices that are driven by transportation costs that are induced by the lockdown. Two instruments and OLS, we find evidence of very high levels of complementarity across suppliers within the same industry. We find that OLS slightly overestimates epsilon, which is not surprising because during the COVID crisis, there has been simultaneous negative demand and supply shocks, which would tend to bias epsilon upwards. Now, what does this high level of complementarity mean for us? Now, when inputs are highly complementary, you can show that even negative shocks to a small subset of firms can have large negative effects on the aggregate economy as the worst affected sectors become bottlenecks. Now, this lack of substitutability across suppliers can partially explain the fall in GDP in India during the COVID crisis, and we show this in an extended production network model by embedding our elasticities. To conclude, what we do, we leverage variation in input prices following the COVID lockdown, and we provide one of the first estimates of elasticity of substitution across supplies within the same industry. We embed these elasticities in the production network model, and we use them to quantify the role of complementarities in the propagation of shocks to the entire production network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devaki. So to any of you, if you have any questions, please just speak up or raise your hand so that Devaki can see who has a question.
Devaki, could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So I know you and I have kind of informally talked about this before, but I have another question that I don't think I've asked you yet. So when you're looking at the substitutability, I guess you can observe the expenditures between firms and the prices they're facing for firms that already are have like a relationship. But I guess a key margin for substitution is if one firm kind of like gets shut down, then how easy is it to find a new one that I haven't already established a relationship with, and how can you measure this when you're thinking about?
Yeah, this is a super good question. So actually, I guess there are two strands of literature in this. One is this paper on Bakai-Farley paper, and then the Paradise of Vinat, and this strand of literature which actually takes the network structure as given. And that's the approach we have followed. And then there's this other literature on endogenous network formation from Lee and many other people who contributed there. However, you're totally right. The extensive margin is very important. And what we can do is only capture the intensive margin. So what we do is we basically correct for this extensive margin, that how the price index of the firm's price index will be biased due to this entry and exit. That is what we correct using something similar to the Finstra correction term, more like the Redding-Weinstein 2020 approach. But this does not, but this is just to correct for the bias that will arise in the estimation in the intensive margin. So we do. It's a very good question.
Can I come in?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Devaki, for your presentation. And I think your topic is very interesting, especially for me, because I had a paper and I needed an estimate of elasticity of substitution across inputs, and it has been very hard to find such an estimate in the literature. I have, however, two questions related to your work. The first one is, you are looking at elasticity of substitution across supplier for the same good, right? At the level of the firm. My wondering at the first place is there any reason we can think that there may not be suitability? Because, okay, how do you explain the complementarity that you find out at the last? Because if it is the same good for the firm, it is the same input, and then the firm should not have accept the reason I am missing that I am asking you to explain me. The second question is, as you are finding complementarity across supplier for the same good during the time of COVID-19? Don't you think this is merely driven by the fact that the supplier themselves are facing maybe equal constraint in producing the output they finally sell to the firm you are looking at?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and it's because you're right that this complementarity is something which is kind of what we're finding can be driven by many things. Like the literature has persistently showed that the effect of the time horizon has an effect on complementarity, because in the long run you can find alternative suppliers. There are surge costs, so all these things come in the long run. We're only looking at like a very short time, like month-to-month estimation, and that really could explain. So our estimates should really be taken as what happens in the short run. In the short run, these inputs are very complementary. Maybe you need like some material from one firm and another material for another firm to produce your input, and then once supply from that one firm reduces, you really don't have option to get another supply in a short time. So really the time horizon matters. We couldn't do it long term because we didn't have the shock for the long term. The COVID shock is very short-lived. So with an alternative estimation strategy, you could think of looking at this long term. Very good question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Devaki. Again, a very nice paper, as the others have said. Estimation within an industry as the because in this global supply chain literature, much of the emphasis on complementarities has been on, from a snake approach, a sequential chain approach. It's the substitution across different chains, and in some sense, across different elements of the chain. But what you're doing is within an element of the chain. What is that elasticity? And that's a crucial elasticity. So the fact that you find complementarity within a chain, and then that's going to complement the complementarity across sequential chains. So that I think just exacerbates or makes just for a bigger amplification mechanism. So then I guess my question is, have you thought about, I guess it's more of a comment, putting your estimates into a chain model, a snake model, I think would be interesting, because my understanding of the Bakay-Farhi framework is it's kind of an extended version of the Caliendo-Paro model. So it doesn't really have the snake feature to it. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if the room will close in like 40 seconds, but yeah, we haven't done that. And it's a great question. And the Bakay-Farhi is basically the generalization of the old long and cluster framework into a CES and with multiple nests. So it's really like it's not a snake model. So actually, I don't know if the cascading effects would be larger in a snake model. So yeah, if you have ideas on that, I'm very it would be great to, I'm happy to chat offline on that. I haven't thought about that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Devaki. Unfortunately, the room will be closing. So we have a 10-minute break now, and then the next session will start at 5:02. So if you need to stretch your legs, get a drink or something, and now's the time to do so. So if you could just join the main session again, that'd be great. But thanks so much, Devaki.
Thank you.